He is a retired four-star general of the U.S. Air Force and also served as director of America's National Security Agency and Central Intelligence Agency. Joining RT now for an exclusive one-on-one interview is General Michael Hayden. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin our discussion with a major news event that took place last week, that event being the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Now, Mr. Chavez was known for his hardline stand towards the U.S. He even accused the CIA once of plotting to kill him. Will relations with Venezuela be troubled if Vice President Nicolas Maduro succeeds Chavez as president?
You know, one fears that they might, but one also hopes that they might not. I think President Chavez, a very strong populist, clearly very popular in some segments of Venezuelan society, he took an awful lot of his support, an awful lot of his identity, simply by appearing to be in opposition to El Norte, in opposition to the United States. And whether or not we were causing him problems, it was convenient for him to accuse us of causing him problems. I actually think the problems right now that they have in Venezuela are structural. Although he enjoyed wide popular support among the poorer classes, he did not do much to reinvest in the infrastructure, reinvest in the oil industry on which state resources depend. And so I think the new president is going to have to take a very realistic look at what he needs to do in order to carry out, even to continue, some of the policies of his predecessors, which was, you know, let me be fair, some elements of strong social justice. But you can't share things you don't have. You have to create. And that requires greater cooperation with the private sector and other segments of Venezuelan society, and frankly, greater cooperation with the United States.
Let's shift gears now and move on to another topic that's been dominating the headlines, that topic being drones, of course, due to the nomination of John Brennan as CIA director. Now, U.S. drones have reportedly killed 1,300 people in Pakistan since Obama came into office. Those people, not just terrorists, but a lot of civilians too. This has outraged Pakistan, an ally of the U.S. Many critics say that the U.S. drone campaign is actually inciting a lot of hatred towards America and breeding terrorism and terrorists. Do you believe drones are the right weapon in the war on terror, and are they being used in the right way?
Yeah, this is a complex question, and it doesn't allow a simple answer. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, said something very interesting in an interview in which I was a participant. Richard said when it comes to targeted killings and the use of drones, he's looking not for a switch, but for a dial. And I think that's actually very profound. I think that's very insightful. Look, we believe we are a nation at war. We're at war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. This war is global in scope. And we have both a right and a duty to take this fight to this enemy, wherever they may be. And in some cases, that requires targeted killing in some of the ungoverned spaces that remain on the planet. Now, for the longest time, the immediate effect of a targeted killing that you've, as we say, we have taken off the battlefield, someone already convinced, trained, and prepared to do harm to the United States, that immediate effect trumped everything else. That effect was overwhelming in terms of the calculus one had to make as to whether you should do this or not do it. But even then, 3, 4 years ago, even then we realized that wasn't the only effect. There were also second and third order effects. Effects on our allies, effects on the willingness of others to cooperate, effects on Al-Qaeda recruitment, effects on the global image of the United States. And now I think it's fair to say that those second and third order effects, they're becoming more prominent in terms of the overall effect of an individual action. But you've got to turn the dial. You've got to take into consideration these second and third order effects before you make the decision to take this kind of action.
You say that the U.S. is a nation at war. When does this war end? When is it deemed a success? What needs to be accomplished for the U.S. not to be a nation at war any longer?
That's a great question, and it's one that's been asked by my countrymen. All right, we're at war. Tell me when I'm finished. Let me know how I've won.
What do we need to see?
I understand, and I know there will come a point at which folks like me, with my background, in my experience, need to go to our political leaders and say, you know, folks, the war paradigm served us very, very well, but it was not without its own costs. It was not without its own effects. And now I think we have pushed this threat down to such a level that the war paradigm is no longer that useful to us. And we need to move into a law enforcement or an international cooperation kind of paradigm. Now, to round this out, I think that will come someday. That day is not today.
You served as director of the CIA for nearly 3 years, and you were still in that position when U.S. President Barack Obama took office. There were reports that he was uneasy about using drones excessively, and you had to persuade him, tensions possibly running high at that time. Is there any truth to those reports?
It's very difficult for me to talk about specific operations or to confirm or deny things that my government hasn't confirmed or denied. But I think in general, I can give you this statement. With the exception of detention and interrogation, which of course became a very popular, well-known cause with the change in administration, President Obama embraced very strongly much of the war on terror strategy that President Bush was conducting during President Bush's second administration.
It's clear. He just said there's no longer a war on terror.
But he also, he did, but it's very interesting. He used the phrase we used internally. All right? Internally, the phrase was, we are at war with al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And that was our operational expression of the president's more public global war on terror. So fundamentally, nothing really changed in terms of what the security structures of the United States were doing.
There's now a new discussion regarding drones that's being had, and that has to do with the topic of anonymous drones. Some recent examples of that include 2 drone attacks that took place in Pakistan last month. Those attacks reportedly killed 9 people, including 2 al-Qaeda operatives. Now, Islamabad immediately filed a complaint, a protest with the American embassy, but U.S. officials came back and said, look, we're not responsible for that attack. We haven't had any activity in Pakistan since January, and the Pakistani government says it wasn't us. And there's now no clear way to know who was operating those drones in Pakistan. Do you believe that this drone warfare, this drone campaign that the U.S. has been leading, will eventually open up a Pandora's box of anonymous drones? Because as of last month, there are a reported 50 countries that are now using drones.
Well, that's a great question. And I know the incidents you're referring to. And you have to understand, I'm out of government now 4 years. I only know what I read in the newspapers. But I find it quite curious. What does it teach me? What does it suggest to my thinking? One thing is that the tribal region of Pakistan is truly lawless. All right? No one is exercising sovereignty there. It's also very clear, as you point out, I mean, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles is not a God-given American right. Other nations will follow. I mean, we have been leading the technology here, but the technology is not all that daunting. Other countries will follow in our footsteps. That puts a great deal of pressure on the United States in terms of how it actually conducts itself with these weapons. We are indeed setting precedent that others will almost certainly follow.
President Obama is no longer running for a second term in office or running to keep his job. Some would say he's running now for the history books. Do you believe he should deliver on his promise to close Guantanamo Bay?
I actually think the promise was a mistake. All right, now, I realize there are a range of views within my country on that. But I go back to the premise. And by the way, President Obama agrees with the premise. We are a nation at war. He said that consistently. Otherwise, he couldn't do many of the things that he is now authorizing us to do. You have to begin with the war paradigm. Okay? One of the aspects of armed conflict is the right to detain enemy combatants. So my debate with President Obama is not that he hasn't lived up to his promise to close it, but I think the promise to close it was unwise. By the way, you realize that we reduced the prison population at Guantanamo during the Bush administration far more dramatically than has been done in the Obama administration. I mean, we understood the branding issue that was Guantanamo, but we also understood we were at war. I mean, look, on Labor Day weekend, for your viewers, that's the first weekend in September here in the United States, in 2006, I moved 14 prisoners from CIA detention sites, the so-called black sites, to Guantanamo. I needed a place to put them. Guantanamo was a perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable place.
Recent polls are showing that only 15% of selected Muslim countries approve of President Obama's foreign policy. Is that dangerous? Is that troubling in any way?
Of course it is. Now, look, it's not a popularity poll. I mean, we're not out there to be loved.
Something George W. Bush said and
right.
Obama has said.
Let me draw a comparison. I'm 39 years as a military officer, so I go back a long way. I remember something called the Cold War. I bet you many of your viewers remember it as well. And during the Cold War, we actually talked about the close fight and the deep fight. And here, in the Cold War, the deep fight was largely ideological. And it was about Western views towards economics and political democracy and Soviet views. And frankly, that was argued very strongly between the two groups. But when that was argued, Mike Hayden from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had a legitimate view on communism. Because whatever else communism may or may not have been, it was a Western philosophy. And so when we entered that conversation, my views had legitimacy because I was speaking from my own cultural tradition. In the current war, the deep fight has to do with something going on inside Islam now. It's very hard for Mike Hayden from Pittsburgh to enter into that discussion about Islam. I have no legitimacy. In fact, when I do enter in that discussion, I make things worse because I have no authenticity in making that kind of comment. So what we see going on now, I think, is a struggle within Islam. It's a struggle that all the monotheisms have gone through: Christianity, Judaism, and now Islam. And it's a struggle with modernity. Without drawing your viewers too far back into history, Christendom went through this in the 17th century, at the end of the 30 Years' War, when we decided, you know, we've got plenty of reasons to fight with one another, but let's not include religion in the list anymore. Right? And we embraced a more secular approach. We separated the sacred from the secular. I think Islam is going through that great debate now, but that debate is within Islam. And we'll have to see how it turns out. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but I think that's really what's going on.
You've most recently spoken about the threat of cyber warfare, and you say that it's coming from China. But what about groups like Anonymous?
This distinction is something that the Chinese have earned. They've worked for it over the years. The Mandiant report that came out about 2 weeks ago that focused very heavily on one particular unit in the People's Liberation Army that worked for the Third Bureau there, PLA-3 as we call it. I had someone, a colleague of yours from your profession, call me up and say, wow, this Mandiant report is big news. And I said, well, it's big, but it's not news. I mean, anybody who's been doing this knows what the Chinese have been doing. Now, to be more accurate, the Chinese have been stealing stuff. They've not been using the cyber domain to create damage, you know, to destroy networks or things like that. But they've been stealing stuff on an unprecedented scale. Now, all right, truth in lending, all nations do this. I was the head of the American organization that did this for the United States, and frankly, we're quite good at it. But we and some other nations around the world self-limit. We steal secrets out there in the cyber domain to keep Americans free and to keep them safe. We don't do it to make them rich. We don't do it for commercial benefit.
Isn't stealing? I mean, you know, it's
well, let me rephrase that. It's espionage, and espionage is an accepted international practice.
When that Mandiant report came out, some were saying, but wait, the hands of the United States are not clean. The U.S. has also played a huge role in cyber espionage, and even some saying that the U.S. had a major role in the Stuxnet attack, allegedly carried out by Washington and Tel Aviv against Iran. So isn't the U.S. in some way throwing stones when it lives in a glass house?
I don't even speculate, given my background, on who may or may not have been responsible for Stuxnet. But I do agree with the premise of your question. That's a really big deal. I mean, someone just used a weapon comprised of ones and zeros to now The practical description was to take over the control system at Natanz and destroy 1,000 centrifuges, which I view as almost an unalloyed good. But I can rephrase that sentence and say someone during a time of peace just used a cyber weapon to destroy another nation's critical infrastructure. Wow. That's an important development. Yeah, I fully understand the import of the fact of Stuxnet, leave alone who may or may not have done it.
And we'll have to leave it right there. General Michael Hayden, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.